holiness, on the holiness of God, and where we may have talked about the terror of that holiness. Today I want to finish by bringing our attention to the beauty of the holiness of God, and especially what's required of us in order to see the beauty, because it's not immediately apparent. Not everyone has the eyes to be able to see the beauty of holiness. It's very easy to be swayed over in one direction, to where we think of holiness, we think of God's demands, we think of his requirements, and we think sometimes only in an Old Testament fashion of he's long-suffering, but when he is coming to the end of his long-sufferingness, God is quick to pass judgment and say, I'm going to wipe them all out, or this people is finished, or this is the punishment for that. And so it's easy for us, if we get out of center, if we drop out of our frame of reference, to miss the beauty. We recognize that it is beautiful, and
5 minutes later.
Oh, the beauty and terror of God's holiness. So it is beautiful, and we can sometimes struggle to see that, and it's terrifying, and sometimes it's very easy for us to see that. And it's difficult for us to put those two things together, but if you're any kind of a thrill seeker, and as I'm looking around, I see a lot of thrill seekers here, so if you're any kind of a thrill seeker, you understand beauty and terror at the same time, right? So, like, when Mike's telling me about how his truck will go, 120, 130 easy, right? At that same time, what did you say? I was fully alive, right? Yes. Maybe it wasn't you. But anyway, somebody told me that once when they were, they got their vehicle up to that fast, and it was both beautiful and terrifying at the same time, because, one little squirrel runs into the road. And, I was talking to Rick, about Aaron's rock climbing, right? And so there you are hanging on the side of the rock with a piton driven into a crack, and you're fully alive because you're hanging, thousands of feet above the Yosemite floor, and your whole life is hanging on that one belay point there. So it's beautiful, and it's terrifying at the same time. And it's the same way with God and his holiness. We need to see in Scripture here both of these things. We see God in his beauty. We see God in his holiness and the frightening nature of that holiness. But we need to bring these two together to get the full picture of that. When you and I come into God's presence, we sang all these beautiful songs about God's grace this morning. We sang these songs, and each of these verses and choruses spoke about the wonder of his grace, how Jesus gave himself for us, how we were saved because of the blood. And so we feel really good about that. That is just beautiful. These are beautiful songs to sing. But then we stop and think, but wait a minute. I literally, because of the sin in my life, have no business being in the holy presence of God. And so we have to have both of those things held together. Yes, I have no business being here this close to the altar of God, because there's sin in my life. And yes, I am repentant, and yes, I realize I'm forgiven. But that one truth makes it terrifying to come before God. And then when I realize that because of the blood of the Lamb, because of the cross, because of God's grace, I am able to be in there. I can hold both of those truths together. The beauty of his holiness and the terrifying demands of his holiness. Of course, I'm painting this picture that we saw in Isaiah chapter 6, right? God says, Isaiah, come, here's this vision. you're going to stand right in front of me and you're going to look upon me. And us, new covenant people, we go, this is awesome. And yet Isaiah shows how we should feel. I'm in a bit of a predicament here because I've come into the full holy presence of God. And because I'm here right in front of God, this realization of the depths of our sin, of the things that, the little sins that we wave off and go, well, it's not that big a deal. It's just a golden calf. It's not that big a deal, right? But God doesn't look at it that way. Any sin, any unholiness, and you're subject to being wiped away. And so here's Isaiah. God brings him. He says, come closer, come look at me. And Isaiah, as soon as he comes into that presence of that holiness, he's crushed. Woe is me. Woe is me. I'm a man of unclean lips, and all my people are in the same boat. But what does God do? God takes something that belongs to him, the holy fire of his altar, and he makes Isaiah holy. And so Isaiah's looking at the beauty and the terror at the same exact time. I mean, what a beautiful picture of holiness, and what a beautiful picture of grace. When we really think about grace, when we process it and not just accept it, when we think about grace and what it requires, we realize that it's only because God extends his grace, only because he gives his grace to us that we can be in his presence, because there's nothing we can do to earn it. Right? Ephesians 2:8 through 10. There's nothing we can do to earn it. There's nothing we can do to work our way into it, because if we did, we would boast about it. So it's purely by that grace that we're to be saved. And we realize that. But then we realize that it's only God in his mercy and his benevolence that can extend that to us. It is God who says, you can be in my presence only by my power. Well, now we're humbled a little bit now. I mean, when we realize that it's only because God looked at us and pointed at us and said, you can come into my presence, that we begin to see this depth of grace and the meaning of this grace, and how it's only by grace that gap between God and us is closed. And so what I was talking about last week is we never want to fall into the trap of making that cheap by just taking it for granted. By just going, well, I'm saved, I can do whatever I want. I'm saved. My sin's immaterial now. I'm saved. God is good, and so on. We want to use all these truths, the beauty, the terrifying nature of the holiness, the fact that it's only by God's mercy that we can be in his presence, and bring all these things together to kind of draw this difference about seeing the beauty of God's grace. God's people should be able to see the beauty of his holiness. We should be able to see any mention, any reference to God's holiness in his word and go, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And here's the contrast with those who are not yet God's people. The lost can't see that. They if I can steal from the Bible here, they lack eyes to see and ears to hear. They can't do this. They look upon the holiness of God differently. They look at it this way. They say, well, God should just forgive me. If God is so big, why is he upset about this sin? He should just go ahead and wave his hand and make it okay. Because they can't see what holiness required. The lost lack the eyes to see the depth of their sin, the guilt of their sin. They can't see it. They can't feel it. They can't see it in the nature of holiness here. All they see is God condemning them. They see that God should just forgive them. He shouldn't condemn them. He should look the other way. He should do all these things. And in their minds, that would be holiness. And yet the Bible speaks completely differently about them. We're going to go back to the Psalter again this week. Psalm 98. If you've got your Bible, let's turn there. Psalm 98. Let me read the first few verses. Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have worked salvation for him. The Lord has made his salvation known and revealed his righteousness to the nations. He has remembered his love and his faithfulness to Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of God. Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have worked salvation for him. And we read a number of those instances where God's people, where God relented, where God forgave, where God allowed his people to continue to exist. Yes, God has done these marvelous things. God brought them into the land that he promised them. God had brought all the descendants and the king that was necessary. God had done all of these wonderful things. Okay, so that's the good. Everybody can see the beauty in that. All of Israel could see the beauty in those things that God had done. But then the question was, did they see the beauty when God exiled them? Did they see the beauty of God's holiness when he wiped out a generation in the desert? Did they see the beauty of God's holiness when Achan and his family and his livestock and everybody was taken out in the desert and stoned? Did they see the beauty of that holiness? And that's always the struggle for Israel and for us. They say, well, God's not very fair if he does something like that. And if they get to this point where they're saying, well, that's not fair, God shouldn't do that. You know, what Achan did wasn't that bad. The golden calf wasn't that bad. This wasn't that bad. That was. But God's perfect, pure holiness doesn't allow a not so bad thing to exist, right? There's no gray area. There is what God says, what God demands, what he says will be. There's that, and then there's everything else. And we tend to live over here sometimes in this everything else category. We go, well, this isn't so bad. This is in that gray area between really bad and pure. And if we can get ourselves to learn, if we can get ourselves to understand that God's perfection, the very nature of his holiness, if we can understand that it doesn't allow that gray area, that is only black and white, there's God's way and every other thing over here. If we can get to understand that, then we begin to see the beauty of what he demands of us and what he's moving us into. In the second verse here, the Lord has made his salvation known and revealed his righteousness to the nations. Well, now we get a little better picture of why he does what he does with Israel. Israel was to be a show place, right? Or a display plot. Everybody was supposed to look at Israel and see the holiness of God reflected. All the nations around them were supposed to look at Israel, see them worshiping God appropriately, living by the covenant that Yahweh had given, and all these things. And they were supposed to look at that and see that. But instead, they look on Israel and they see a rebellious people, a stiff-necked people, as we read earlier. They see this stiff-necked people who are constantly in trouble with God. And then they see a people that is exiled out of the land by God because of their consistent persistent and unrelenting sin. They see this people that is not only exiled out of the land, but generations of those people die. They stay out of the land. They see a God who is so demanding that he kicks his people out of the land. He kicks them out of their promise. He lets generations of them die in a foreign land. And he says, only a few of them are going to come back. Now, to the lost, they say, well, that God is completely unfair. That God should be a lot nicer to his people. That God should just let some of this stuff go. But what happens when we start doing that? As soon as we do that once, we do it twice, right? Then we do it 3 times. And pretty soon, there's God's way, and then this enormous gray area over here where we say, well, not so bad, a little bit bad, very bad over here. And pretty soon the beauty of God's holiness is so diminished. We see it only in legalistic terms. And that's what happened with Israel. They kept testing the boundaries of that. They kept testing the limits of God's patience and his grace towards them, and wound up in exile, wound up pushed out of the land, wound up divided, wound up only having a small representation at the end of their era. So the beginning of this psalm, it concludes this way in verse 3. He has remembered his love and his faithfulness to Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of God. So the ends of the earth, all the people around them have seen what God has done. They have seen how he has acted with his people. And they have seen in the exile, in the destruction of people, and the people who never came back to the land, they see all this. They see all this and they say, that's a holy God. That is a God who stands for his covenant. That is a God who demands holiness of his people, calls them to be holy in the same way that he's holy. And then he's fair, he's just. His righteousness stands up for things. And so we bring that into our own time. And now we are these people of grace, where God has said, you will vest the whole of your belief, the entirety of your trust in Jesus Christ. You believe that he was who he said he was. He did what he said he did. You believe that. You'll be saved. Great. We've got that. We're locked in on that grace. But then we have to live up to the covenant that he makes with us. And so while we point to Israel, and we say, well, boy, they really struggled. In our day and time, we sometimes find ourselves not very different from Israel. We find ourselves living our own way. We find ourselves making our own idols. We find ourselves doing all the things that Israel did. When we consider God's holiness, it should be a cause for worship. It should be a cause for us to celebrate, like the psalmist is directing here. It's not something to be frightened of. It's something that is beautiful because we see that it's in that holiness that grace is extended to us. It's in that holiness that God's grace actually has meaning, right? And yet we still fall back. We still fall back. We say God's demand for me to be holy as he's holy, that's some kind of a burden on my back. We see in the context of grace where God should just go, okay, you're saved now, everything's okay. And then we read, like St. Peter says, be holy as I'm holy. He copied that from Leviticus. He brings it up. He says, be holy as I'm holy. And we see that now as this weight on our back. So, well, I thought God forgave me. I thought God was okay with me. He loved me now. And it weighs him down. But God's people should never see it that way. God's people should never see his holiness, his demand for us to be holy, as this burden on our back, as this weight that we carry it around. We should see God's holiness as what we're called to live up to. We are called to be the beauty of his holiness, to come up to that, because other people come and look at us. Other people come in the same way they were supposed to look at Israel, to see us as examples of God's holiness, of how he's working things out in us, how life is better when we stand up and live up to the covenant agreement. That's the whole idea behind God extending grace to us accepting us, and us becoming members of this new covenant people. One of the things that Christians chafe against most commonly is that command in Luke chapter 9, Luke 9:23. In Luke 9:23, Jesus says, if anyone's going to come after me, if anyone's going to believe in me and be my follower, you know what it says after that. Let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Well, we struggle with that. We chafe with that. That seems to be in our minds, sometimes in our hearts, contrary to the grace that God extends to us. We say, God forgave me. I didn't do anything. I didn't work. I'm perfectly good in that respect. But now Jesus wants me to give up my life and follow after him and serve him. And so we struggle with that. We have a hard time with that. We don't want to let go of our old life. We want to keep the old life and the new life. We want the old ways and we want grace at the same time. And the reason we do that is because we think we're going to miss out on something. We think if we fully die to self, if we deny our old life, we say, okay, that's behind me. I'm not going to live that anymore. Then I'm going to miss out on whatever that was. That life will not be as rich over here. But here's the deal. And I know this is hard to hear, hard to process, hard to make our own. Unless we step over that line. Okay, unless we actually do this, and that is deny self. Die to the old self. Unless we actually do that, we can't see the full measure of God's holiness over here. It absolutely requires that we be obedient to what Jesus says. That we deny ourselves, we leave that behind, and we point the rest of our lives, the rest of our days, towards following him. We make that the object of our life, and we commit everything in our life to that process, to following him. So only when we cross that line, only when we actually die to self, do we get the eyes to see, the ears to hear, the ability to see the beauty of God's holiness. Unless we do that, unless we die to self, unless we cross that line, we'll forever be in that trap of God's holiness is a burden. God's holiness is terrifying. God's holiness is frightening, and it's too demanding. It's something that I can't be. Die to self, come across the line, and then being holy as God is holy becomes second nature. So what Jesus is requiring is not beyond us. It's just something that the old life tries to hold us back. Believe me, every time we try to die to self, every time we try to put the old life behind, you know it doesn't go willingly. You know the old life is constantly trying to claw its way back into our days. But that's where faith comes in. That's where faith in all the things we've just been talking about comes in. Do we trust in God's promises? Do we trust what he has assured us? Do we trust what the Lord Jesus says would be our days if we step across that line? When we have faith, we cross that line, we die to self, we say, okay, that's behind me, this is what's ahead of me. What does Jesus say in the very next verse? right? To lose your life is to gain. To lose your life is to gain everything. If you lay down your life for me, everything is yours after that. But if you refuse to lose your life, if you refuse to lay down the old man, the old woman, if you refuse to do that, you're never going to see the fullness of life. And so the question of faith is, do we have the faith to step across that line, to point our eyes only at Jesus, and then see the fullness of the beauty of holiness come out before us? Well, here's the questions to ask yourself. Has God ever failed on any promise? And the answer is no. Has everything that God has promised come to pass? The answer is yes. So every promise, every assurance that we have from God, it's anchored in the holiness that you want to see. Every promise that he makes comes from this God who's never failed to deliver. That's anchored in the holiness that you want to see. Everything that we're asked to trust in, everything that God reveals about himself, that we're asked to put our trust in, to put our faith in, is anchored in his holiness. And so it's only when those things become true in us, only when those things become our reality, that we can see the fullness of the beauty of the holiness of God. And so, see, the train agrees with me. So this is what the psalmist is speaking about. This is what the psalmist is leading us to in the last verses of this. Starting in verse 4, shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Burst into jubilant song with music. Make music to the Lord with the harp and the sound of singing, with the trumpets and the blast of the ram's horn. Shout for joy before the Lord the King. Now, this is a raucous response to God's holiness. This is not people cowering, saying, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips. This is celebration, because the God who has called us out, the God who has delivered salvation, the God who sacrificed his son, it's this God that we're celebrating, this God that we're worshiping, and this should be the biggest celebration, the biggest response to God's holiness. Shout for joy to the Lord. Not meek and quiet. Shout for joy to the Lord. Let the sea resound and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. Let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains sing together for joy. Let them sing before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. And he will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples with equity. And here's where holiness comes around to its conclusion. When we fully see God in his holiness, and we really assimilate the nature of his character in our minds when it comes to settle in our hearts, we see holiness differently. We see that everything that God does is a measure of that holiness. So his requirement that we be this way, his requirement that we follow this command, his requirement that we be his people and be holy, all these things are not anchored in some capricious God who's just up there making up things. He's saying, I want you to be like me. I want you to be living up to the image that's within you. I want you to be so attractive, so winsome, so beautiful, that all the peoples around you look upon your life, they are envious, and they want the same blessings that you enjoy. And so just like the psalmist was speaking that to Israel, Jesus speaks that to us. This is why he says, leave your old life behind. Put your eyes completely on me. Follow me alone, and everything will unfold out in front of you. And one day, the same as the last verse there, the same as the Revelation shows us, one day everybody's going to be judged. And where we say that's not fair, where we say things of that nature, where we question God's requirements of us, where we question what God says is bad, what we think is bad, none of that will exist. When every human being stands before God in judgment, it's not going to be anchored on something that God made up. It's not going to be anchored in anything that's fair or not fair. It's going to be anchored purely in His holiness. This is what Paul says about the law in Romans. He says the law existed so we would know what sin is. So you think about the 10 Commandments, right? You think about all the requirements that God gave. He didn't give those to make our lives miserable. He gave those so that we would know what sin is. Okay, we know what sin is. It's crystal clear in front of us. We as Christians stand before God. He looks at us through the lens of Jesus, but our sin still comes with us. And then we think about our neighbors, our loved ones, and the lost who can't see any of this. They can't see a bit of this. There's nothing beautiful in the fact that God will judge. It's because they're still sitting in the fair and not fair situation, the fair and difficult, and why doesn't God just let me live my life situation. And that's where we come in. That's why we are who we are. That's why the church is what she is, so that we can show the beauty of what God requires of us. God's holiness is to be feared, for sure, and worshiped. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time. But it's those who have the eyes to see, those who understand grace and its cost, those who understand that everything that God does and requires of us is anchored in His holiness. Those who have eyes to see that, we can worship that. We can soak that in. We can see how holiness proceeds to the grace that you and I know and we understand. And when we do so, when we have eyes to see and our hearts are tuned to that, we can proclaim salvation. We can proclaim the gospel to people all around us. We can do it using words. We can do it using our lives. We can do it using the example of God's church. We can proclaim that gospel. Even though we live in this world that is mostly insulated to the message of the gospel, we live in this world that desires more to make mud pies than to dine with the King. The evidence of holiness in God's people in His life is really the only thing anymore that's going to make that message come forward. So when Peter said, "Be holy as I'm holy," when he brought that forward from the Levitical words, he was making a statement about the nature of God's church, the way that you and I and all the rest of the church should be. And it's when we see the beauty of that holiness, the beauty of what God is calling us to be, we will see it as the invitation that it is. We are seeing it as this invitation to be beautiful as God is beautiful. We're being invited to let the image within us be what the image was intended for us to be. To let the holiness of the image of God dwelling within us shine out and attract the rest of the world around us. Amen?